Hello, everyone. I think that we're live. Some of you are checking in now. Some of you have been waiting. We're glad to be here. This is the Markaz Review's roundtable conversation on Burn It All Down, our current issue. And it is, of course, going to be moderated by Lina Mounzer, who is our senior editor at the Markaz Review. And Lina comes to us from Beirut. She is a Lebanese writer and translator who's been known to spend time in Canada. She's been a regular contributor to the New York Times, and her work has also appeared in places like the Paris Review, Freeman's, the Washington Post, and the Baffler, as well as in a couple of anthologies. Lina, what would you say is your favorite breakfast?
Oh, that's fun. I thought we went over that on our Markaz Review podcast, which you guys should check out if you want to get to know the members of the team. It really hasn't changed. Scrambled eggs with lebni. And then sometimes I'll mix it up by like throwing the lebni inside the omelet, but like eggs and lebni are kind of an unbeatable combination. So
Sounds good to me. Mine is shakshuka when I have breakfast. Alina, it's over to you.
all right. So thank you everybody for joining us for this evening, for this discussion. Well, it's evening for us, Abdurrahman in Pittsburgh. It's during the day, I guess. But it's thank you to everybody who is here. I've really been looking forward to this discussion. We've invited 3 writers here from our latest issue, which is called Burn It All Down, and whose theme is obviously the current moment and the urge to kind of want to burn it all down. And so I'm very, very happy to have here with me 3 wonderful writers who have written really incredible pieces. I'm very, very proud, very happy with this issue. And I think, each of these writers has contributed a piece that has spoken both to and for a lot of people. So I'm going to introduce our 3 writers. So first we have Layla Al-Ammar, who is a writer and academic from Kuwait. She earned a PhD in Arab women's fiction and literary trauma theory, and she has an MSc in creative writing. Her debut novel, The Pact We Made, was longlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. Her second novel, Silence is a Sense, was shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. She's written for The Guardian, Lit Hub, The Times Literary Supplement, Arab Lit Quarterly, The New Arab, GQ Middle East, and New Lines magazine. Next, we have Abdurrahman Al-Gendi, who is a Dietrich Fellow at the University of Pittsburgh's Nonfiction Writing MFA and a Heinz Fellow at Pitt's Global Studies Center. His work has received awards or fellowships from Logan Nonfiction Program, Tin House Workshop, and Bread Loaf Writers Conference. He was a finalist for the 2021 and 2023 Margolis Award for Social Justice Journalism. And last but certainly not least, we have my fellow compatriot, Michelle Eid, also from Lebanon, is a researcher, consultant, and editor. Her areas of interest are socioeconomic rights and development, focusing on agriculture and food sovereignty in the Levant. She's the editor-in-chief of Arawiya, a magazine focused on the Levant region. So welcome to all 3 of you. It's really, really nice to have you here. And so I wanted to open actually our session by asking each of you, Kifkun, how are you guys? How are you doing? And, I was thinking about this after rereading Abdurrahman's piece, in which he talks about asking that question in Arabic versus asking that question in English, and what sorts of responses it elicits. So I'm going to ask each of you, Layla, kifik, Abdurrahman, kifak, and Michelle, kifik.
Should we just jump in or?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Aish, I guess that's how we respond in Arabic always. Aish. Yeah. Alhamdulillah.
That's interesting because that's like, it's the all of our answers to these questions are always like very rote answers, right? So I'm fine, I'm okay. And then you just gave the Arabic rote answer, which is like, I'm alive, which I guess is like one step lower than I'm okay,
Yeah.
Standing and not crying. I saw that there's like a Norwegian saying or something where you're like, I'm standing and not crying. That's as good as it gets. Yeah, no, it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I think I echo Abdulrahman with as well, because I respond Aishin, not even Aisha, Aishin, because I feel like it's a collective feeling at the moment where everyone around me feels the same way. So we just have the same answer to this all the time.
Noticed also.
Yeah.
Sorry. No, I've noticed also since Ramadan started, the social media content has not been what it usually is in Ramadan. It's been a bit more somber and serious, and people are not posting as many, of those like kashha outings and like all decked. There's a bit of a somber tone this Ramadan. I've noticed it on social media in the last week or so.
And no photos of food as well, I've noticed. Like usually people post photos of iftars, they post photos of gatherings, and like nobody has really been doing that. And like, I don't know, I mean, I don't know how how it is in Kuwait, but no, I don't, Michelle, if you, I know in Lebanon, it's also felt like really subdued just in general. Usually Ramadan's a little bit more festive. There's lights up in certain neighborhoods and stuff, but usually, there are certain places that get filled up after a certain hour, after everybody's had their iftar, and but now you really feel that everything is subdued. And yeah, that's very true. Yeah, this idea actually, Michelle, of like this collective grief, and I think that that's kind of what Abdurrahman's piece speaks to, in the fact that it's this idea that when you speak in Arabic and you ask this question in Arabic, it's almost like even if you reply Aishin, like, oh, we're alive, everybody knows what's behind that, as opposed to I'm fine, which you don't know if you're talking to somebody who cares, doesn't care, etc. And I'm finding that actually quite difficult to navigate, in that I feel like I can only speak to people who understand the weight of this moment and who understand like what this kind of collective horror that we're all sort of being forced to watch. And I find it very difficult to relate to people who are sort of that like a secondary, that are like truly Aishin. Exactly. I mean, the irony of that is like Aishin, but no, actually mish Aishin, we're like half Aishin. And I'm finding that very difficult. But and this idea of collectivity actually is kind of what was the thinking behind this this issue in general, which is that everybody was expressing this feeling of like, I want to burn down the whole world. I don't want it to be And Leila, your piece, I mean, I found your piece so beautiful because it's so wide ranging. Like it just in all of these different ways, you go across time, like it scrubs back and forth, like through different personalities across time. And you take us through kind of almost the social media landscape of these different Palestinian writers who, people in Gaza who we've been watching and witnessing, go through what's been happening. And occasionally also being witness to them dying. I mean, and being witness to everybody asking, where is Rafat? Where is Bayan? And we don't know what's happened to them. And it's just, this absolute horror, right? And, you talk about the untranslatability of certain words, the way that Abdurrahman does as well. But there's one point in your essay where you say, we've been trying to burn this world down for 100 years. And, and yet here we are, right? And like nothing started on October 7th, obviously. And I mean, how do you see this moment as different, let's say, than other historical moments, right? Like Adorno famously said, there will be no poetry after Auschwitz. And here we are now, as writers from the
Darwish
world.
said something very similar after the invasion of Iraq. In 2003, Darwish said something very similar to Adorno's sentiment. Sorry, I cut you off there. But
not at all. I was going to just say, as a writer, I mean, how do you reckon with that? And how do you, because your essay is sort of almost about this idea of this like very long protracted moment, and
I mean, I wrote that piece at a very, very low point in all of this, where, and I really struggled with even writing it because, you know, like you said, I did my PhD in trauma theory, and so much of, well, so much of that is about how insufficient language is in capturing trauma and really articulating it. And so it almost feels like a contrivance sometimes to try and put trauma into words when really there are no words. And, you know, often I would just, my tweet would just be اللسان يعجز عن الكلام, like there's literally nothing to say in the face of this horror. And then, you know, the reason why I threaded so much of what was happening on social media with Mus'ab's tweets and Raf'at and Markaz and all of these people that like you say, we've been following and feeling so intimately connected to, you know, the reason is because I felt so uncomfortable.
First name basis.
We're on a first name basis. And, you know, the reason, and that's part of the reason why I felt so uncomfortable writing this piece, you know, because they're the voices, they're the ones that we should be highlighting, they're the ones that we should be quoting, they're the ones that we should be, you know, they're the ones who are witnessing this horror. And I suppose what makes this horror and this catastrophe so different to the previous ones is how it is literally being live streamed. And you can't say that about the Holocaust, you can't say that about the intifadas. I mean, it was not on this scale where we were literally living, like live streaming this genocide on our screens 24/7, 7 days a week. You know, it's just that, I think, more than anything is what, you know, kind of marks this one out, is that literally the whole world is watching it. You know, and we're watching it unfold. And at the same time, it's highlighting for all of us, I think, how utterly impotent we are and how powerless we are, you know, against these structures, these, you know, neoliberal, capitalist, fascist structures that are governing the world. And I think everyone around the world is realizing that we really are powerless, you know, and maybe those of us in the Arab world have kind of always known that we don't really have that much political power at the end of the day, but it's kind of broken through that mask in the West where the people really did think that they had power. And now it's like, you know, all these protests, all of these, you know, stopping of highways and, you know, blocking all of this and that. And the genocide is 5 months in now. You know, so
I think 6 months at this point,
6
actually.
months in, yeah. So it's
half a year, which is mind-boggling.
Astonishing. It's astonishing, you know, that it's gone on this long with such impunity in the face of all of these protests and all, like, it's astonishing to me.
No, I mean, I agree. And I think one of the things, you know, you were saying, you know, in the Arab world, I feel like it's been like layers of recognizing our powerlessness. Like I've always thought about it, you know, in terms of somehow like the privilege of marginalization, which is that you don't need things to be deconstructed for you. Like we don't have these moments of like reckoning and awakening that the West has, where you're like, oh my God, my government, you know, is everything they've ever said is a lie, and politicians you're like, oh, of course, everything is corrupt, everything is awful, like we don't expect better, right? But I do think that there's still been these layers of absolute horror. And one of the things, you know, that we've been reckoning with, which like Abdurrahman talks a lot about, and I think for me, it's been truly shocking, is the fact that like how complicit journalism and the media is in all of this. Like I would have never, I don't know, starkly, yes, absolutely shamelessly, starkly watching these headlines, you know, kind of, I don't know if one of you had tweeted this or whatever, but like, I mean, obviously everybody's tweeting the egregious headlines, but there was one today where like the New York Times had a headline that said, a firework is lit, a chocolate shot.
That nice little riddle.
Yes. And you think, my God, like the pretzels they're putting, you know, that they are twisting themselves into, right? And so you have English on the one hand, which is the language, you know, this mediatized narrative, this sanitized narrative, this like extremely you know, language being used to obfuscate. And then you have, on the other hand, you have Arabic, which is not just, you know, as you're saying, Abdurrahman, in your piece, that like we understand each other on that level when we, you know, when you ask kifak or kifik or, you know, how are you doing, etc. But like even beyond that, what we're watching as we're watching these videos is we are watching people language that we have done so and do so, you know. So can you talk a little bit about this? I mean, there's many questions that I want to ask you, but I think to begin with, I sort of want, there's a line in your piece that really intrigued me where you said, I've always asked myself if I can afford not to write in English. Today, Palestine pushed me to question how long I can afford to write in English. And I find this really interesting because you sort of like have subverted that kind of thing, right? Because here you are now, you're in the United States. Obviously, you are connecting with people in that language that you said allows you not necessarily a seat at the table, but to point to the table. So what is it about this moment that's making you feel like, you know, this idea that you don't even know if you can afford to keep writing in English?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about Fadi Judah's latest collection. I've just written a whole like kind of response to it in the form of a letter that I think is sort of in my head is a continuation of my piece with the Markaz in a way. And I think one of the lines I ran to grab the collection so I can read it. But in he has like the penultimate poem, like the one before the last. It's called dedication, and it's like and it's all like a dedication to people. And towards the end, he says, to the martyrs who did not furnish their photos for their killers to air them on their compassionate TV, to the martyrs who did not speak English, to the relatable and unrelatable, the translatable and untranslatable Palestinian flesh. And I think this was sort of what I was grappling with, this idea of complicity versus necessity. I've always thought it was necessary to write in English because it gives me currency, as I say in the piece. And it forced me to point at that table and talk about its occupants and feel like, you know, I'm kind of forced to speak this language so I can actually have any kind of political power. But on the other hand, with everything that's going on right now, I've been thinking a lot about these sentiments that Fadi is talking about in his collection. Is like, how much am I contributing to the perpetuation, you know, of this sort of trap, all those like linguistic systems that are fashioned to entrap our tongues and flesh, and making them kind of retain that currency. And I've been thinking a lot about the Edward Glissant and his idea of opacity, which is like, how can we write in English? Is sort of what I'm grappling with right now. How can I continue to write in English, so I can still have that currency without being complicit in the perpetuation of those systems? Like, how can I subvert the language enough? How can I make it opaque enough? So my like I write in the piece, so my oppressors or executioners or whatever we call them are not consuming me comfortably. I'm kind of always unsettling them and making them uncomfortable, making them always, you know, aware that this is not for them, it is for us, and I'm subverting and manipulating their language. The line also from Fadi's collection that I'm constantly thinking about now when I think about my piece, is when he says, I'm removing myself from the we of you. And this is something that I've been constantly thinking about these days, because they have an idea of a we that just exists in their imagination. And I feel that we're constantly, or at least, you know, those of us who grew up kind of internalizing, you know, everything we've internalized growing up in the Arab world, we sometimes, when we come here, which has been my trajectory, we try to write ourselves into the imagined we that they have of us, so they would have sympathy for us. And I think why this moment is different is now we're kind of getting divorced from this idea that we want to find an alternative we that is just of us and for us and written, you know, with us in mind, from us, kind of all like revolving around us in a way. I think this is what I was kind of thinking about writing this piece. This piece was different for me because I guess, yeah, it's always kind of a built-in situation where I think I should approach a page or an essay with answers, or at least a vague idea of what an answer is. And I feel for me, this piece was like the first time I decided to be like, I'm just gonna take the questions and that fracture that I mentioned at the beginning, like something fractured. I'm just attempting to write my way into that fracture. And this is really how the piece came together for me. I did not sit down and write this piece knowing what I was gonna write. But I felt there was this tension that I'm grappling with here, and I need to speak into it in a way. And I feel it's been really, really helpful to me to articulate these things, and articulate that tension, what it feels like to be alive within that tension. I keep thinking of it as a barzakh, of so like this kind of limbo in between, and also how barzakh is another untranslatable word. So it just keeps all kind of feeding. It's like a loop that feeds each other. So yeah, I think this piece for me is the beginning of thinking of what are other alternative modes of being and knowing that we can start moving into that are not necessarily, knowable or familiar to the Western modes of knowing, or meaning making. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the fact that it doesn't offer any answers, and the fact that it sort of is, it stands in the bewilderment, right, of the question. And I think that's really what why it related, like why it resonated with so many different people who felt like it really, spoke for them in kind of not speaking, and it relates sort of to what Layla was talking about. It's like this idea of like, I have no words, right? We keep repeating that, but then and in that sort of the silence, which is also Fadi Jouda's book, that
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of,
yeah.
we have an excellent review
Bracketed
also
ellipses.
coming out next week. Yeah, exactly. It's this idea of like silence, like this inability to speak, and
Unsayable,
the
untranslatable.
unsayable, absolutely. The
Yeah.
unsayable and the untranslatable. And I think that, this is something that I've always thought of writing in general as a kind of translation, like you're translating a kind of personal experience, you're translating an internal state into external words. And, once they're in words, they're that, sometimes you have these very amorphous feelings, and then you're kind of concretizing them. You're putting them outside of your body, and you're, placing them in these kind of molds and things like that. And I think, if part of the problem with this moment is that things are shifting so fast, as Layla was saying, we're watching the genocide being live streamed. We don't even have time to grieve or mourn. Both of you actually talked about that in your pieces, that there's no space for grief, there's no space for mourning, there's no time to even say, this is the worst thing that has happened, because it is constantly shifting. And yet at the same time, when I look back, we were using the word genocide within 2 weeks, right? Because we know this, and we've watched these tactics, and we consume a different kind of, news media, whether it's in Arabic or the fact that it is, being broadcast in that. And Michelle, I mean, you as a reporter working here and working in the midst of everything, I find it really interesting that like fighting for space, like we're talking about like all of this like direct human cost, but what your piece talks about is another form of, I mean, I've learned so many words now, including but like this idea of I didn't know there was such a thing as herbicide, for example. But what you're talking about is like something even beyond that, which is like the deliberate destruction of agricultural lands of, can you talk a little bit about that, and talk about how do you also even like fight for space to talk about things like that, when there is like how do you, it's like how do you even begin to hierarchize the trauma, which is something that we should never, do the triage, basically.
So I guess it all started with my mother's hometown being bombed and being hit with white phosphorus and different forms of artillery shells. And my mom's town is known for its olive oil production. It's called Mes. It's a very, very small village close to the borders. And virtually nothing exists there but a few family houses, vast groves of olive groves, and just the ruins of or sites of heritage sites. And when I was looking at Israel bombing, or reading about Israel bombing my mother's hometown, in addition to a bunch of other hometowns or towns in the south. But not only towns, rather agricultural areas or open land. It frustrated me a lot because, you know, what Israel tries to convey to the world is that it's bombing military sites. It's bombing sites that they deem are not civilian. Meanwhile, when we're existing in Lebanon, we're looking at what's happening, and we're looking at how international media is not even covering what's happening properly here. I don't know why my mind immediately resorted to one word that I've read before during my studies, which is ecocide. And I read more about ecocide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I read more about ecocide, and I looked at what's happening here, and I said to myself, what's happening is ecocide. They're killing our biodiversity because it is very intentional. You know, when you're bombing agricultural land that has no, by any means, not one indicator of a military site or a military target, you can only assume that they're hitting it for one purpose, which is killing the land and thus killing the culture and the heritage. Because this is what occupiers do. And we've seen this all over the world through different forms of, or through different colonies, through different colonizers, is that they try to attack and destroy the culture and destroy the land. So the natives don't have any connection to that anymore. And I guess this is where my, the idea for the piece came up, specifically with white phosphorus as well, because we're not talking about any type of weapon here. We're talking about white phosphorus, which is an incendiary weapon. And by incendiary, they mean it keeps on igniting as long as there is oxygen, it does not turn off. So there have been remnants of white phosphorus shells currently in the south, and they reignite in the ground. So the damage is not a one-time thing. As long as it gets oxygen, it can reignite, and it can not only, you know, injure people around it, but it can injure the land, it can pollute the soil, it can pollute the water. And this is not going to only be affecting the people of South Lebanon. It's affecting Lebanon as a whole. It's affecting Palestine as well. It's affecting Syria because, you know, these borders that we have, they're artificial per se, in the sense that, you know, the poison, I guess, or the chemicals that are seeping into the ground are not just going to stop at the border at South Lebanon. It's going to go into the land, into Syria. It's going to go into the land, into Palestine. So what's that doing? What that is doing, sorry, essentially is creating these, you know, long-lasting effects, which haven't been researched long enough even, you know. So if you look at any research about white phosphorus online, and its effects on humans, on land, etc., it's very, very limited. And I believe the United States Army or the CIA has some research on that, but it's not very accessible either. So we really don't know what's in store for us as, you know, as people in Lebanon or in the region because of the use of this weapon.
Yeah, I do find that very scary, actually. And it's, I mean, we've seen also that there, you know, there's still remnants also of shells and stuff from the 2006 war. I mean, people still continue to die from cluster munitions. And we, you know, we also have, I remember during 2006 also, there was this, you know, a lot of the cluster bombs, they looked like toys, children's toys. And so the kids would come and pick them up and they would have their limbs blown off. And we're seeing also that happening now in Gaza, where, you know, there's like bombs that are actually designed to look like tins of food. And, you know, they are exploding as people are coming to pick them up. I mean, one of the things that I've been grappling with, and I'd be interested in hearing all of your thoughts, is like, it's not just how do we express what is happening and the trauma that is happening, but like, how do you grapple with this idea of evil, like this evil, right? And evil itself feels like, you know, we analyze again and again, it feels like a very simple word to use. It feels like a very easy word to use because it sort of, in a way, it almost like absolves people of responsibility, you know? At the same time, we're in a particular moment where we have all been taught that the greatest, hugest, you know, worst form of evil that ever existed was the Nazis, you know, and the Holocaust they perpetrated, which is like also on a scale beyond comprehension, right? And so everybody in trying to reach for words to explain what this evil is reaches back to this idea of Nazis. And of course, that in itself is like a kind of taboo where you cannot, equate these two things. And it's like, so, how do we come to try and explain this evil in a scale that fits both in what is happening now, what is, I mean, how do you explain it to yourself, and how are you able to sort of like give it both its historical continuity, right, like of where it comes from, but also its completely unique character? And I'd love to hear from like Leila, Abdurrahman, and Michelle, like how, for yourself and as writers, how is this something that you are able to grapple with? Because I find this very difficult, like to kind of even speak about what, like the perpetrators and what is being done, because the obfuscation of the perpetrators is in fact what keeps happening in the media. So I do think about this idea of cause and effect. It's like, who is the perpetrator and how do we describe them?
I think that's, I mean, we could spend a whole seminar just talking about that question. You bring up the Holocaust, and that's kind of the foundation of trauma theory as well, and trauma studies. And so much of literary trauma theory is very much predicated on Holocaust narratives, and a lot of the language of trauma, at least literary trauma, or when we're narratively talking about trauma, can trace back to that, and it kind of, I think, quite purposefully was given this sort of exceptional status. And I'm not in any way diminishing the horror of it, but humanity has gone through many horrors, and holding one horror up as somehow unique or more exceptional than Rwanda or Palestine or the Uyghurs in China, or this is a world that is filled with horrors. So I don't think of it in terms of how do we compare the evil then to the evil now, or thinking of it as a scale or a spectrum. I think it's a lot more benign than that, to be honest. Not benign, sorry, like banal than that. I think it's the product of systems, and systems that work together, systems that are complicit, systems that furnish, that lay the groundwork for this sort of catastrophe to occur, or for these genocides to occur. Thinking about a perpetrator, it's systems that work together, and that work together to dehumanize, to remove the humanity from people, to obfuscate, like you say, to create narratives that are not true, to twist language to suit narratives, and to keep people out of the conversation. And that's why, like, sorry, this is kind of jumping back to what we were talking about, language. In the early phases of this, like October, November, December, I was having so much cognitive dissonance between what you're seeing in the West, and even from some Arabs in the West, this talk of peace and diplomacy. And it's like, no, nobody's talking peace and diplomacy. Like that, those are not terms that we use here, and then on the other side, right, you're listening to, like, the radio stations here in Kuwait. We would listen to the news every single day. And there's something so refreshing about hearing things described as they are, bil Arabi, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Where it's like, al-Kayan al-Sahyuni, Kuwait radio will not even say the name, or Quwwat al-Ihtilal, like,
or al-Adu al-Sahyuni, and
al-Adu, or even, and this is something that was really aggravating me at the start, was this constant refrain of the war on Gaza. And on the Arab radio, on the Arabic radio, it would be al-Udwan ala Gaza, the aggression. And these nuances and these differences of language matter. You know, when you're describing something as a war, you're perpetuating this idea that it's between two more or less equal sides, you know, who are in this conflict. Whereas Udwan and aggression on Gaza really clearly shows that this is a one-sided affair. You know, that this is violence being directed towards a people who are in no way, you know, in any state of being able to defend against that aggression. You know, I sort of went off topic, but
No, I think you're 100% on topic, you know. I think it's, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is like, I mean, you're absolutely right in the sense that, you know, the systems are fundamentally to blame, right? But that is also, I feel, what is so overwhelming is that as we are seeing how in cahoots these various systems are, and the way it really is like these Gordian knots of, that are impossible to untangle. And I think that that's really what gives a sense of like, feeling hopeless, having no words, being unable to sort of name things because it's so massive. And what is required to change it also feels like truly you have to burn the world down, you know, in order for it to be able to like, you know, for us to reconstruct, if we can even reconstruct something that, you know, that makes any kind of sense. And because, you know, I always think about the fact it's like, reparations are impossible. There's no coming back. There is no, you know, there is no consolation for the dead and the traumatized. There's no, you know, history is not consolation. There isn't, you know, and that feels like a really defeating and difficult and terrible thought. And especially, I think, you know, as writers, it's even hard to like grapple with it. If you think about like narrative structure in general, that we always try to arrive at some sort of, you know, if not, you know, a happy ending, then like a resolution or some form of resolution. But, you know, there is no resolution here.
Yeah.
And
but I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned narratives because, you know, part of my PhD work was looking at Arab novels. And, you know, if you read Arab novels, there are no happy endings. I mean, the novels, the literature, the Arab literature, I mean, the body of Arab literature shows the cyclicality of this trauma and these catastrophes that we can't get out from under. And it kind of breaks with that idea that there is some sort of redemption coming or some sort of restitution. I don't know.
yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and actually, Abdurrahman, I'm interested in the fact, I mean, you moved to the States fairly recently. I mean, as far, right? And I guess my question is, and it's, you know, you come from a country that has a lot of turmoil. You yourself have also been, you know, a victim of that turmoil. How do you translate yourself, so to speak, you know, in this environment? And do you find it also difficult to kind of explain, because you talk about this, and I think all of us know this, is that the fact that like in the Arab world and in each of our countries, the Qadiyya al-Falastiniya, the entire Palestinian struggle has pride of place. It's something we're all raised with, we all understand. It's all, you know, this kind of collective solidarity, even though our governments could not be worse, but among the people, there's always this fellow feeling with Palestine. How do you, you know, are you able to translate that? What is it like for you, like as a writer, as an Egyptian, as a person, as an Arab, being suddenly finding yourself in the United States in the middle of this kind of situation? How do you translate yourself, your position, your positionality, etc., all of these things? Like how do you grapple with that on a personal level? Because you talked about how you try to reckon with it as a writer.
Yeah, I think I've been obviously thinking so much about that right now, and I'm going to refer again to another piece because I've been writing everything, all the questions, right? So I've just written this piece called On Execution with Mizna that I've been constantly thinking about too, and I'm still kind of grappling with the questions in there. But it kind of borrows from the concept of execution that Salma Sharif, the Iranian American poet, establishes in one of her poems. It kind of ends on this question of you know, have you thanked your executioner today? And Salma has always been preoccupied with the concept of empathy, right? What empathy is. Empathy is an extension of imperial violence. and as a really despicable concept and term. And my whole piece is sort of a dismantling of the concept of empathy. Why do we seek empathy anymore? And I guess the answer to your question is, I'm seeking the spaces where I don't have to translate. I'm avoiding all the spaces and people that would require I translate so they can engage with me in any way. So I'm thinking a lot about the idea of empathy forces us to sort of be kind of in that trapped in that duality of execution, executing for the executioner and being executed by them. So executing in terms of as performing, basically, to execute something, but also being executed as to be killed with a legal order. And illegal is like a very important thing here. Like this whole world is invested in our death with all its legal backing and courts, right, and systems and laws and whatever. So I'm thinking a lot right now about how to stop, again, divorce myself from this idea of having to address my executioners at all. How do I just like sidelight them, ignore them? And if any of them undergoes the radical enough unlearning and relearning, then they'd be willing to put in the labor and the effort to, stand on tiptoe and kind of peer in and be in community with us somehow. If they're not willing to put in the effort anymore, then I'm not interested in translating for them. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do right now is just thinking a lot about how can we start not to execute for our executioners. How can we think more about what it means to be accomplices and not allies? Like allyship is an extension of that concept of empathy, right? So
Yes,
if you have empathy, you're an ally. So I'm no longer interested in your empathy or your allyship. We need accomplices, which means they're people standing with us shoulder to shoulder, bearing the costs and the consequences of liberation with us. And most often they tend to be people who also have their own kind of liberation battles. And we come together to this sort of understanding that it's all interconnected. Like all liberation is interconnected. It's one thing I struggle to kind of translate to people here too, when they talk about my stance as being in solidarity with Palestine. I'm like, I'm not in solidarity with Palestine. Literally, the only reason everything that happened to me, I was in prison for 6 years in Egypt, because this whole empire is sustaining the Egyptian regime, because its main role in the region is enforcing the blockade in Gaza. It's literally inextricable. We cannot be free until Palestine is free, and vice versa. So it's just all very tangled, like you said. It's inextricable from one another. And I want to be always now within people and spaces where I don't have to explain all this to. And I'm okay with kind of interacting with others if they're willing to put in the labor of unlearning and educating themselves and kind of being in community with us, being accomplices with us, bearing the consequences. I'm just not willing to let people off the hook anymore for kind of, performative allyship that is just sort of, virtue signaling and all that. So yeah, I guess just to boil it down is just like divorcing from the concept of execution at all for the executioners, empathy, just like let go of all this and relinquish the myth that this system would give us humanity and liberation if we keep asking nicely enough. It's just not going to happen. Yeah.
I think you articulated perfectly that kind of frustration that a lot of people have been coming to in various different ways. This idea of like, we're not asking anymore. We don't want, it's like, we don't want a seat at your table anymore. We don't want any of this. Like, we're just going to go off and kind of do this thing and, or like make our own spaces. And the question of our and we and all of this is something I think is, it bears questioning, like who steps into that space, who is allowed part of that space. But I mean, what you said also is, this idea of like, yes, I think that a lot of us I'm not going to say all of us, but I'm going to say like, let's say the majority of us in this part of the world, are very aware of how all of our faiths and the faiths of our countries and our potential democracies are tied to the issue of Palestine, because so much of this part of the world has been suppressed and oppressed because, in order to bolster the state of Israel. And I think, nowhere is more of a better example of that to a certain extent than Lebanon, in the sense of like, are we able to even think of ourselves independently of, the Palestinian question? Because, you'll have a lot of people in Lebanon saying, we have nothing to do with this. We want to be independent of this. And it's like, have never been independent of this. We have always been secondary targets. We have always been, we have also been perpetrators of violence against Palestinians, but at the same time, you know, like our fates are so inextricably linked. I find it a little bit crazy that, you know, and I mean, can you talk a little bit about that, Michelle? I mean, I don't know, not to put like words in your mouth, but I found it very, one of the things that has sort of destabilized me a lot is like watching this horror happen, and at the same time knowing that نحن ببوز المدفع, like we are next in the mouth of the cannon, and not knowing, I mean, there's already a war on the south. People sometimes talk as if we're not part of this war, but we are part of this war. We have so many displaced people. Civilians are dying every single day in this war. So how do you sort of grapple with that, you know, like being part of it, but also being outside of it, you know, in Lebanon? And how do you, you know, as somebody whose mother is from the South, also like just.
I guess one term that I can use to describe it, I don't know if this is very dark, but it's existential dread. Because like you said, we know that Lebanon is next, you know, in one way or another, one part of Lebanon is next, or the entirety of Lebanon is next. And so going back to your initial question as well, I don't have any words to describe the evil that we're seeing right now. I try to conjure up words or conjure up terms, and I feel like there are no words in the dictionary that can describe what's currently happening in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank. We're seeing what they're doing in Jenin, in Tulkarm, and all that. And so being here, I feel, and I don't know if this properly answers the question, but I feel like I'm living two realities where I'm looking at what's happening in Gaza, I'm looking at what's happening in Lebanon, in South Lebanon at least, and I'm going insane. I feel like I'm going insane. And on the other hand, I'm just waiting for what's coming up next, you know, because we see how they're not only limiting their attacks to southern Lebanon or limiting their attacks to the border towns. And like a lot of us have echoed is that they're not only looking at these specific areas alone. I mean, they've been in Baalbek, they've been in Beirut, they've been in Nabatiyeh, they've been in Saida.
They hit my own village last week. Yeah, it's
So it puts you in the state of understanding no one is safe, you know?
And not to mention, as you often talk about and, you know, post, is the constant flybys. Like we have them in our skies all the time, the sound of their jets, the sound of the drones. Yeah.
This is essentially psychological warfare. They're not doing it for fun. They're not doing it, you know, for defense reasons. They're doing it to let people in the country know that they're watching us. And unfortunately, we feel that all the time. I mean, I remember I was sitting earlier today and they would not stop with the constant flying. And as I'm trying to work, all I know is in the background is that they're above my home right now. They're above my house. They're above the houses of all my family and friends in the country. And we don't know what they're going to do next. So that being said, no one is safe. And we can't just think about it as an isolated the word that they love to use in the West, the conflict or the war. It's not isolated, and it's not only conflict, it's not only war, it's aggression, it's colonialism, it's imperialism, it's in its many forms. And yeah, I guess, I don't know, like I'm trying to find harsh enough words to try and continue to describe this, but I really can't. I mean, even the word genocide, you know, like cleansing, they feel so minute, they feel so small in face of what we're seeing, the face of what we're seeing right now. And even, you know, and I mean, we're seeing this also happen, similar things happen in Sudan and Congo and all that. And you start thinking, I mean, these, because of how much people in the international community also try to tell you, oh, you can't be using this word, you can't be using these words, you're not an analyst, you're not, what's the word, I can't remember the word for professional, but point being is that it feels like they're also undermining the experience that the people in these countries are going through just for bureaucratic practices. And I'm saying this as someone who graduated from Sciences Po. I studied humanitarian law and human rights law and development. And I'm very frustrated because I see a lot of people around me still refuse to use the word, even though we're experiencing this aggression, or not we. I mean, we as in the region. I don't want to take the experience as my own because I get to sit in my home tonight safe, you know? So it's not my experience, it's the experience of my brothers and sisters in the South, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and so on. I feel like I rambled a little. I have so much anger in me and I don't know how to get it out.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And but I would put, you know, it's this idea, it's what Layla said, all of this is very deliberate, right? Like this is very deliberate, this idea of language, the way we're allowed to use language, the way our language is policed, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that was also my question earlier, is like, yes, you're right, genocide, imperialism, colonialism, et cetera. And it's this idea of like, it feels though that this requires a new word almost, not because it isn't any of those things, it is, but in a way to sort of break people out of their stupor. I think because, you know, a lot of people hear these words and they're like, oh, it's kind of the same old thing. And you're like, but this is like a unique horror, the way every horror is a unique horror, you know?
I think
we
also
do have a question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think, you know, just to pick up on what Michelle was saying, I think also a lot of our frustration maybe stems from the fact that it's so absurd at this point, where it's nonsensical. You know,
Yeah.
people who continue to reject the term genocide, or to say, you know, there are certain, I don't know, like official benchmarks that it has to hit before it's officially called a genocide. And it's, you know, any person with just, you know, any sort of common sense it's just laughable, you know. And it almost feels at this point where it's like they're operating in a different reality that's not the same as the reality that we're seeing and that we're experiencing, you know, where there's no, I mean, it reminds me of this line that Muhammad al-Kurd wrote in one of his poems, Al-Rifqa, where, you know, what's debatable in English is a fact in Arabic, or, you know, maybe it's the other way around. What's a fact in Arabic is debatable in English. And you know, it goes back to that, where it's like, immediately we were calling it ibadah jama'iyya. Like we knew what was happening. It's so obvious, you know, and the fact that these common sense things are still debated is infuriating, because it takes up space. It takes up space that could be spent saying something productive, instead of constantly going back and forth on terminology and whether it applies or not.
I found that funny because I was like literally pulling up a quote by Muhammad al-Kurd to cite. He has words, yeah. But like I was thinking about that exactly. Again, like back to the idea of like I don't even like care anymore to have them sign off on it as a genocide. And in his piece, the right to speak for us, the right to speak for ourselves in the nation. He also said that we cite the words endlessly. Why do the words carry so much heft? Why do we give the authority of narration to those who have murdered and displaced us, when the scarcity of their guilty consciences means honesty is never guaranteed? Why do we wait for those carrying the batons to speak when our bruised bodies told the whole truth? I think that it just comes down to that. We just should stop citing them or caring what they say or waiting for them to sign off on what our bodies are already telling us and telling the world. Yeah.
I see, Abdurrahman, you brought this up in several, like, you know, at several times. And I think like, I completely agree with you and I completely agree with the sentiment. My question though is like, how do we build like, you know, if language has failed us, and how do we, you know, and what Layla said now also is very true. It's like, it really feels like we're inhabiting different realities, right? Like, so the language that we need is not just to be able to talk to people. It's like to bridge this abyss between two different realities, right? And so one of the solutions is to say, you know, F it, we don't want to talk to you anymore. But the question is like, how do you recruit new accomplices? And how do you build the solidarities that are required? I mean, these things are happening organically, but to a certain extent, I do wonder, it's like, well, how do we bridge that gap of reality? Like, how do we even begin to, you know, speak to people? I think everyone should be bombed. Kidding. Everyone should live under war for like a little amount of time so that they understand what, you know.
Yeah.
No, but I think, you know, just to pick up on that, maybe, because, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There is a shift in narrative, and there are many people who are waking up to the reality that we've lived in all our lives and that we're very intimately familiar with. There are people on the other side who are genuinely waking up to that. And I think a lot of it has absolutely nothing to do with language. And it's the fact that this horror is being live streamed, and you can't argue with the videos and the pictures, and you don't need words for that. There's no denying what we're seeing. You
I
can't
think if
deny
people
it.
still need, like, if they still need language to bridge that gap, they're probably not the people we're interested in. And I don't know, I think also, like, I feel like a role is also like, we don't have to always provide solutions. Like with the essay or whatever, I feel like our role is to constantly complicate the questions and can keep complicating the questions. And the question that you just posed right now is just a new essay. It's like a new mode of thinking, but we cannot get to the question of what does that look like if we do not, relinquish what it used to look like. That's why I think it's important, even if we don't yet know what it's going to look like literally at the end of the essay, that's what I say. The path forward is unclear. It's still like filled with blooded debris, and seared flesh that's still happening. But we're never going to move beyond that if we're not going to relinquish that illusion that something could come out of the system if we ask nicely enough. Like, once we kind of get to that point, then the new question would be, but then what is the alternative mode of being or knowing or being in community with one another? Which we could have another seminar on, I guess, down in the future. But it is
And yeah,
obviously
absolutely.
a critical question, but we cannot get to that critical question unless we relinquish, the past way we were being in this world.
Yeah, I agree. It's just even difficult to think that far forward, considering we have, I mean, for myself personally, I cannot imagine what the day after that everybody keeps talking about could possibly look like, or even when we will get to it, there is no the day after, I think. And yeah. I don't know if we have, so we've been talking for an hour. I think we could go for another hour. I don't know if we have questions from our audience. Nobody has asked a question yet, except there is one question from Leah Yanaton, which is: the companies that make the bombs are located all across the US. Do you think organizing human chains around them would be an effective action? Which is like a little bit out of the scope of our discussion, in terms of what are effective actions that could be taken. But I suppose any action, any physical action, it's like what you were saying, Abdurrahman, is this idea of, accomplice versus allyship. Yes, it's the difference between a passive, I stand with you, to an active, I will, Molotov cocktail with you, side by side. And I think definitely, I mean, that's what's required, is like actual active work. Everybody has to roll up their sleeves and do what they do best. But I don't know if anybody has any questions. But no, it doesn't seem like that there are questions. Do you guys have questions for each other? So Jordan, are we supposed to wrap up, because so that we don't go over an hour, or can we keep going for a little bit? Oh no, we do have questions. Okay. I spoke too soon.
You can go on longer. It's not written in the Bible that you have to finish in an hour.
Okay.
But I do have one question for you if you want to address it. You don't have to, which is, why do you think Israel acts with such impunity? I mean, that's a big question. It gets into a lot of geopolitics, but I just wonder what your theory is on that.
Because it can.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Because it can.
I was saying in most of this, like, حد يلاقي الدلع وما يدلعش.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly, because it can. I mean, yeah. Sorry, Michelle, you were going to say something.
Oh, no. I mean, because we know at the end of the day, corrupt and awful systems, whether they're imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, all these different things are very interlinked. So Israel knows that by design, it will be able to fall back on these different systems of oppression that exist around the world, whether it's the US, whether we can talk about some complicit Arab regimes. it's like you guys were saying earlier on, it's all interconnected. And like Abdurrahman was saying, I mean, just like if when you know, Palestine is free, everyone else is going to be free. As long as Israel needs help in continuing its oppression, these different systems of oppression will continue to hold them up and holster them up and allow them to keep on doing what they do. Because if Israel falls, that's when the structure crumbles. Not when Israel falls, it's not only them, it's going to be all these different, you know, different parts of the structure that are going to fall with them as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I think that's also why it's really difficult to kind of imagine the day after. I mean, I don't know. I've had this debate with a lot of people, but I don't know how you guys feel. I feel like we're watching the beginning of the end of Israel. You know, I don't know that it can sustain itself under this this level of brutality. Because it you know, as a colonial state, it is predicated on, you know, brutality and ethnic cleansing. So what happens when it sort of collapses? And I always think, like, how many of us is it going to take down with it? You know, but then some other people don't think that. They think, you know, we can keep, you know, that this could continue on for years and years and years. So I don't know what you guys think, you know.
It's interesting. I recently read Sari Maqdisi's book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, which talks about this whole culture of denial and tolerance that Israel kind of built its image on. And he, you know, very convincingly argues in the book that a lot of these affirmative values that Israel has kind of sold itself as this narrative of tolerance and democracy and all that other bullshit, that those masks are crumbling and falling away. And he, you know, he talks about how a lot of the goodwill that they had built up among just the general populace in the West was starting to crumble as well. And so, you know, I do think that this genocide and this mania with which they're behaving now, in the way, like I said, that it's being live streamed and there's no arguing it. You know, I think that is taking down the last of the goodwill, you know, among people who either didn't really know about Israel-Palestine or didn't really care. Now they're being kind of forced into that arena of, well, you need to kind of pick a side. You need to kind of fall down, you know, on some side. Whether that will ever translate into political action, where the Zionist entity itself comes down, I don't know. I think we're still at least a generation away from that being a possibility.
I think I've been.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. No, you go ahead.
Now, I was just thinking a lot. I think the way I'm navigating the current moment is like, it's like the way I was navigating prison, which is weird, but yeah, I feel like that this is the way I'm able to survive today. Is when I was in prison, I used to think, because I didn't know my release date, right? I had a 15-year sentence. And I used to think, I got to a point where I thought that radical hopelessness is the only thing that would liberate me and enable me to survive, as in to stop thinking of the light at the end of the tunnel as a possibility, to stop looking forward to it, to stop craning my neck to see if it's there or not yet, and kind of just settling in this idea of like, maybe it's just the tunnel. Maybe that's all it's ever gonna be. And then what do I do with this knowledge? What does it mean for it to only be the tunnel and no light at the end? And I feel like that kind of shifted the focus for me towards, what does it look like to be a light inside the tunnel if it's just going to be the tunnel for all of us anyways? How do we just insist on being that kind of, like, that being in and of itself becomes the goal rather than the political kind of end goal in the end? And I feel I'm translating this right now in this moment, and just moving forward, I feel the moment I start looking for results, or the day after, is the moment I'll stop working, because everything I'm doing is going to be kind of, you know, it's going to be hinged upon what is going to yield eventually. Whereas now I think it's about the way I'm choosing to be in the world right now, the sides I'm choosing to align myself with, the liberation I'm choosing to work towards. That's what it matters, like what I'm working towards, not regardless of whether or not we're gonna like get there. Maybe if we get there, perfect, great bonus. If not, then it doesn't matter, because I've divorced myself from that result in a way. That's just for me the way I'm coping with everything, or kind of surviving everything that's going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, you put a lot of emphasis on this idea of questions versus answers. And I think that that's definitely a very good way of like, thinking about the world in general, but also like kind of decoupling yourself from having to feel that you need to have answers before you can take action, which I think there's a lot of this thing, and you see that as part of the obfuscation as well in the media narrative. Well, what do you suggest? Well, what else is going to happen? Well, what, it's like, what is your alternative solution? And it's this idea of like trying to stop you. It's like, if you don't have all of the answers, then you can't act. And so everybody's perpetually in this state of paralysis, right? We have a question actually in Arabic from Dawha al-Wazir, I think, which is actually quite, so I'm going to translate it into English, and saying that, because today is Mother's Day, so today is Mother's Day in the Arab world, and because we're talking about kind of like the failures of language, right, and the inability to be able to express things, she's asking, what are the new words that we need? And I think, again, this is a question that has no answer, but I think it's almost like a very poignant question to end on, which is like, what are the new words that we need to use in order to console children and, mothers and parents, and, for this kind of like loss, that there are no more words of consolation. We've talked about words to describe the evil, we've talked about words to describe the trauma, but I think that this is a really good question. Like, what are the words of consolation that we can use? What are the words that in order to kind of like stitch wounds back together? And are there even words? There's always this feeling of like, we need to invent a new language in order to be able to talk about that. And I think that this question of consolation, maybe a bigger word needs to be found, but it's like, how do we put things back together again? Yeah, I mean, Abdulrahman, your whole piece kind of revolves around this idea of like that the word thakla, it doesn't exist in English because there is no word for a parent who has lost their child. Whereas Arabic has that, and and you sort of like, you move from that premise into this idea that the language itself like carries mourning in the way that English doesn't. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what language of consolation we find, or even that we can find any kind of consolation in language. I mean, I don't know how you guys continue, but I think, as writers, there's always this question of like, why do we bother? Like, why do we, if there are no words, why do we do what we do? I don't know if anyone can answer that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was recently, I always find myself going back to Ghada Samman's nonfiction work, and she was very much interested in our Arab dilemma, even in the late 60s, post-Naksa, and the collapse of Pan-Arabism and the intellectual scene. And she talks frequently about her frustrations being a writer and feeling that like it's useless, and what's the point in writing, and she kind of likens it to a scream, that it's better to scream rather than fall into our graves silently, I think is how she put it in one of her essays. And she says, at the end, after this uselessness and after this feeling of la jadwa, like there's no point in it, we pick up our pens and we go back to the page. And I think about that myself when I'm writing. I was working on a third novel, and that just kind of stopped in October, because literally just language fled me, and I just could not do anything with it. And I think about that, and sometimes it's like you get past that silence and that choking sensation, and then something has to come out, whether it's in fiction or in essays or in poetry, or I think for those of us who are writers, we come back to the words somehow, even if they fail us, because there's nothing else. There's no outside language. I think Derrida said that at some point, but you know, that's what we have, and those are our tools, and even when they fail us, we go back to them.
I mean, I think that that's kind of a beautiful place to end on, you know, in that we don't have answers, you know, as everybody has sort of kept going on, and it's not really a happy ending, but it is some kind of resolution in the sense of like, you know, that we go on, you know, and actually, as you say, as you end your piece, you know, if as the catastrophe goes on, you know, so do we, you know, if the catastrophe must go on, so do we. And I find that really just a very poignant, idea, this idea of like the catastrophe is sort of intrinsic to life and our lives. And we just, you know, and it's also what Abdurrahman was just saying about, we have to continue, you know, and yeah, and soldier on. That's a bad metaphor, actually. I don't want to use military metaphors. We ride on.
We ride on.
Anyway, I really want to thank all of you. I thank everybody who attended, you know, this talk, but I really want to thank you guys, Layla, Abdurrahman, Michelle. Your pieces were wonderful. They were, you know, so central to the issue. It was, you know, just, and also a pleasure to have you here and, you know, to talk to you guys. And I feel like it could go on for a very long time, but I mean, for me personally, it's not just, you know, having you guys here as guests of the Markaz. For me, it's been really cathartic to read your work and to speak with you, you know, as writers, as fellow Arabs, as, you know, people who are like living this same reality, who are, let's say, on, you know, to use what Layla said, on the same side of this abyss of reality. For me, it's really cathartic. And I think that these networks of similar-minded people and is, to me, is like the small kind of like webs that I use to like propel myself forward. So thank you, all of you, for your work and your words and your solidarity and your, you know, so
Thank
anyway,
you so much, Lina. And thank you
you
for
so
your
much.
work on this issue. It's a beautiful issue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Is Jordan going to wrap up with some announcements at the end?
Yes, well, we always have our PowerPoint. So there it is. We have an event happening at the end of the month. We're going to be talking about Nazlı Koka's book. She's a Turkish woman who, as an immigrant, tries to make it in Berlin and then gets to New York for some reason. So she'll be present to talk about that novel, The Applicant. And the next issue comes out on April 1st. No kidding. It's called Paris, and it's about Arabs and other people from the Middle East who live in Paris and what life is like for them and how it influences their work. So I think that should be an interesting issue. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Masalama.
Good night and good day, depending on where you are. Yalla, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.